My ex-husband took everything in our divorce, our home, our savings, even my dignity. But what he didn't know was that I still held the one thing he valued most, his company, and I was about to take it all back. I never imagined that my life would change so drastically after my divorce. I thought the hardest part would be signing those papers, the finality of it all. But little did I know, the real battle was about to begin. My ex-husband, Mark, took everything, our home, our savings, and everything we had built together over the last decade. He told me I'd be fine, that I'd figure it out. He made sure to remind me that I wasn't entitled to anything more, not even the furniture, despite my years of sacrifice and support. I was left with the bare minimum, an empty apartment, my clothes, and a broken heart. It was hard to believe that just months ago, we had laughed together in this very house, making plans for the future. But now, I was left to pick up the pieces. Our marriage was supposed to be my happily ever after, but Mark had turned it into a nightmare of betrayal. Our divorce was messy, public, painful. The courtroom felt like a battlefield, where I was just trying to hold on to what little dignity I had left. Mark had made it clear that he was the one who had earned the wealth we shared, the success we had worked so hard for. And while I agreed to the settlement, hoping for peace and closure, something inside me felt unsettled. I kept thinking about one thing, something Mark had taken for granted. The business we had started together, the one he was so proud of. The company was Mark's brainchild, something he built from the ground up. But I had always played a quiet yet crucial role behind the scenes. I handled the finances, negotiated contracts, and kept things running smoothly when he was too focused on the big picture. It wasn't a glamorous role, but it was important. It was my skill, my intellect, that had kept things from falling apart. Over the years, I had become an integral part of the company. When the divorce was finalized, Mark made sure I didn't get a single penny more than what he deemed fair. He had secured everything: the house, the cars, the vacations we once dreamed of taking. But in his rush to take it all, he overlooked something that would soon turn the tables in ways he could never imagine. I remember the day I stood in the courtroom, my mind spinning as the judge finalized the papers. I signed them without thinking twice, not because I wanted to, but because I was exhausted, broken. I thought I had lost everything, but deep down, I knew there was one thing that Mark hadn't accounted for. Something I hadn't shared with anyone, not even my closest friends. I still owned his company. That fact, the one thing he hadn't bothered to check, would be the catalyst for everything that was about to happen. It wasn't until a few weeks later, sitting in my empty apartment, that I finally had the clarity to think beyond the emotional wreckage of the divorce. My lawyer had called, confirming that the settlement was official and that was supposed to be the end of it, but it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like I was still holding on to something I couldn't quite understand. I had spent years with Mark, and despite the pain he'd caused me, I still couldn't shake the idea that there was something more to this story. Maybe it was a lingering gut feeling, something deep inside me that told me I hadn't lost everything. But what? As I sat at my kitchen table one afternoon, sorting through old paperwork I hadn't bothered to look at before, I stumbled across an old contract. It was a document from when Mark and I had started the company, one that had been signed during a time when we thought the world was our oyster. There it was, tucked away in a forgotten corner of the file cabinet, a shareholder agreement with my name boldly printed beside Mark's. It took me a moment to process the significance. This wasn't just some casual document. This was proof that I still owned a share of the company, a significant share. It had been one of those things Mark never bothered to mention, something he thought was insignificant at the time. But it wasn't insignificant. It was everything. I owned a percentage that, in the right hands, could be worth millions. Mark had been so focused on the material assets, the things he could see, our home, our investments, our savings. He hadn't even considered that the one thing he valued most, his empire, might still be in my control. I hadn't told anyone about the shares, not even my lawyer. I had just filed it away in the back of my mind, hoping that one day if I ever needed it, I would have leverage. And now, it was clear. The leverage was mine. I couldn't stop smiling. For the first time since the divorce, I felt a spark of hope. It was bittersweet, of course. I was still hurting, still reeling from everything Mark had taken from me. But in that moment, I knew I had a chance to take back what was rightfully mine. The next few days were a blur. I contacted my lawyer immediately, my heart racing as I explained the discovery. We went over the shareholder agreement together, and when I heard the confirmation that I still had a sizable portion of the company, my pulse quickened. It was like waking from a bad dream to find that everything I had hoped for was still within reach. But I couldn't be too hasty. This was delicate, and I needed to plan carefully. Mark had no idea what I had just uncovered. He still thought he had won, that I was defeated. The smug confidence he carried in his victory was exactly what I needed. It gave me the perfect opportunity to execute my plan, without him suspecting a thing. But there was one thing I had to do first. I needed to ensure that the company was still in a position where I could take control. I couldn't risk Mark realizing too soon what I was about to do. I had to move carefully, methodically. I took a deep breath, looking at the contract in front of me. This was only the beginning. I spent the next few days in a quiet frenzy, carefully laying the groundwork for what was about to happen. Mark was too busy celebrating his victory to notice my growing calm, which was exactly what I needed. His focus was entirely on the physical assets: our house, the cars, the money he had secured. He thought he had everything, but I was about to prove him wrong. My lawyer advised caution, telling me to wait until the right moment to make my move. He was right. I couldn't just storm in and demand control. This wasn't about acting out of anger or revenge. It was about securing my future, and maybe even changing the course of the company's direction in a way that would benefit me. If I did this right, I could take back what was mine and then some. But I couldn't do it alone. I needed allies, people within the company who could support me, who might even be in the dark about Mark's leadership decisions. I contacted a few trusted employees, people who had been with the company from the beginning and who had always respected my contributions. I explained the situation, careful not to reveal too much too soon. They were all shocked but supportive, and they quickly agreed to help me. The first step was to gather as much information as I could. I knew Mark would be monitoring everything closely, so I had to be strategic. I started reviewing company files, emails, and internal documents. It felt strange at first, like stepping into a world I no longer belonged to. But as I dug deeper, the pieces started falling into place. I found discrepancies in some of the company's recent financial reports. Mark had made decisions, big ones, without consulting anyone, and there were signs that he had overextended the business in a way that could have serious consequences. I wasn't just reclaiming control for the sake of revenge. The company needed direction, and I was the one who could bring it back from the brink. I remember the day I first realized how much leverage I truly had. It was a Thursday, and I was sitting at my kitchen table, my laptop open in front of me. I was going over some contracts when I discovered a crucial oversight in one of the company's key partnerships. Mark had failed to secure a renewal with one of our biggest clients, a mistake that could cost the company millions. It was something he would have noticed immediately if he had been paying attention, but he was too distracted by his personal life, too eager to enjoy the spoils of his divorce victory. I leaned back in my chair, my mind racing. This was my chance to strike. I made a few calls to the business partners involved, testing the waters. They were all surprised to hear from me, but seemed relieved that I was still in the picture. In the weeks following the divorce, Mark had been too busy with his personal life to handle business as usual. I wasn't going to let him make a mess of things, not when I had the opportunity to take charge. But there was still a bigger problem. Mark had always been a control freak, a man who couldn't bear the thought of losing his grasp on anything, especially the company. I knew he wouldn't give up easily. If he found out I was making moves, he would do everything in his power to stop me. I had to be careful, methodical, and above all, patient. In the meantime, I kept up appearances. I attended a few social gatherings with friends, pretending that everything was fine, that I had moved on from the divorce. But inside, I was plotting. Every conversation, every interaction was a part of my plan. I was like a silent shadow, watching and waiting for the right moment to strike. The clock was ticking. I knew it wouldn't be long before Mark realized his mistake. He had taken everything from me, but he didn't realize what he had overlooked. And I was ready to take it back, step by careful step. It all came to a head one crisp morning when I received an unexpected call from the company's CFO. His voice was tight with urgency. "Christina, we need to talk." There's something going on in the financials that doesn't make sense. Have you seen the latest reports? I think Mark's been making some questionable decisions. I sat up straight in my chair, the realization hitting me like a freight train. Mark was unraveling everything he had built, and he didn't even know it. I had suspected he was too distracted by his newfound freedom to pay attention to the company, but now I had proof. The CFO mentioned that a few contracts had been mishandled, and there were hints of mismanagement within the company that could put the entire operation at risk. This was exactly the moment I had been waiting for. The cracks in Mark's control were wide enough for me to slip through, and I was about to take full advantage of it. I need to meet with you, I said firmly, my voice betraying none of the excitement I felt inside. I'll be there in an hour. I hung up, took a deep breath, and then immediately called my lawyer. It's time, I said, almost whispering. He had known this day would come, and I could hear the quiet satisfaction in his voice when he responded. I'll have everything ready on my end. Let's make sure this is done properly. The next hour was a blur of preparation. I drove to the company's headquarters, my heart pounding. Mark was still so convinced that he had won, that he had everything under control. He had no idea that I was about to take the reins of the very empire he had thought was solely his. When I arrived, the CFO was waiting for me in his office. He looked as though a weight had been lifted off his shoulders as he handed me the financial reports. I don't know how much longer we can keep this under wraps, he said. If Mark doesn't fix these issues soon, the company could face major legal and financial consequences. I nodded, absorbing the gravity of the situation. But at the same time, I felt a sense of power that I hadn't felt in years. The truth was, Mark had underestimated me, and now I was the one in control. I know what needs to be done, I replied. I'm going to fix this. I spent the next few hours going over the company's finances, looking through contracts, making phone calls to suppliers and clients. It was strange being back in the driver's seat, but I was more than capable of handling it. After all, I had been the one keeping things running smoothly all along. Mark just never noticed. By the time I left the office, I had secured a temporary agreement with one of the company's major clients, preventing a potential fallout. It wasn't just about saving the company. It was about showing Mark that I could do what he couldn't. That evening, I received an email from the company's legal department. It was a simple request. They needed my signature for an emergency board meeting scheduled for the next day. I knew exactly what it meant. They were ready to make me a formal part of the decision-making process, and with that, I would be in a position to take control. The next morning, I met with the board of directors. Mark wasn't there, and he wouldn't be for some time. The board members had all been briefed about the recent developments, and they were eager to have someone step up and stabilize the company. When they offered me a seat at the table, I smiled. I had waited for this moment, and it was finally here. With a calm and steady voice, I made my proposal to the board. I laid out the changes I would make, the areas where Mark had failed to deliver, and how I would take charge to steer the company back on track. Christina, one of the board members said, looking me over with a careful expression, "We've seen the impact you've had behind the scenes over the years. We're willing to trust you with this." And just like that, the company was mine again. I didn't make a big public show of it. There was no dramatic confrontation with Mark. He had no idea what was coming for him. But I had secured my place in the company, and I wasn't about to let go of it. The power I had once relinquished was now back in my hands, and it was stronger than ever. I thought I was prepared for everything when I walked into that board meeting, but nothing could have prepared me for Mark's reaction when he finally found out. It was almost as if he didn't believe it at first. The news had to hit him like a tidal wave, and I could almost hear his confidence cracking as soon as he realized that the company, the one thing he had clung to with such tenacity, was slipping from his grasp. It all came to a head 2 days later, when Mark showed up unexpectedly at the company's headquarters. I had just finished a meeting with one of our largest clients, ensuring that they would continue their contract with us. I was feeling good, confident in the direction the company was heading under my leadership. But then, as I walked out of the conference room, there he was, Mark, standing in the hallway, looking as if he had just stepped out of a nightmare. "You think you can just take everything?" he hissed, his voice low and controlled. But there was something in his eyes that I hadn't seen before. The smugness was gone. In its place, there was anger, a deep, seething rage. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart racing, but I didn't let it show. I had worked too hard for this moment to let him intimidate me. "Mark," I said, my voice calm, even though my hands were shaking slightly. "It's not about taking anything. It's about what's mine, and you forgot that, didn't you?" His face twisted with disbelief, then fury. "You think you can just walk in here, change everything, and take control? You've ruined everything I've worked for. You've ruined us." "No, Mark," I replied, stepping closer, holding my ground. "You ruined it. You've been so focused on your own success and ego that you didn't see what was right in front of you. The company wasn't yours to begin with. It was ours, and I've always had a hand in it. You just never realized how much." His eyes flickered with something, fear maybe, but it was quickly replaced by anger again. He took a step forward, his voice rising. "You're nothing without me. The only reason this company worked was because I put in the hard work. I made the tough decisions. You were just a secretary, just a number cruncher. You think you can handle this?" I stood tall, facing him without flinching. "I'm more than that. I've always been more than that. I held this company together while you were off doing God knows what. You were too distracted with your personal life to notice the cracks. But I saw them. I fixed them." There was a brief, almost imperceptible pause, and for a moment I thought Mark might back down, but then his face darkened further, his hands clenching into fists. "You think you can just walk in and take everything from me? I'm going to make sure you regret this." His words were laced with venom, and I knew this wasn't just about the company anymore. It was personal. Mark had built his identity around his success, around the company he had created, and I had just taken that from him. I didn't say anything. There was nothing left to say. His threat hung in the air, but I wasn't afraid. I had waited too long for this moment, and I wasn't going to let him control my fate any longer. Mark glared at me one last time, then turned on his heel, storming out of the building. But I could feel the weight of his anger and his fear trailing behind him. As I stood there in the silence that followed, I realized something. I wasn't just fighting for control of a company. I was fighting for my life. This wasn't just about proving I could do it better than Mark. This was about reclaiming the power that had always been mine. I had spent so many years in the shadows, supporting Mark, letting him take the credit. But now it was my time to shine. I wasn't going to let Mark's threats or his ego dictate my future. He had underestimated me from the start, and now it was too late for him to take it all back. The days following our confrontation were tense. Mark didn't make any more threats directly to me, but I could feel his presence lurking at every corner. It was as if he was waiting for me to slip up, to make a mistake that would give him the chance to take everything back. But I was ready. I had the upper hand now, and I was going to make sure I kept it. Mark started reaching out to our mutual connections, clients, business partners, and even friends. He tried to discredit me, spreading rumors that I didn't have the ability to run the company, that I was making reckless decisions that could drive it into the ground. He had always been good at playing the victim, convincing people that he was the one being wronged, the one who had been betrayed. But I didn't bite. I kept my focus on the business, making strategic moves to stabilize it and prove to the board that I was the right person for the job. Every decision I made was calculated, backed by facts and solid reasoning. I wasn't going to let Mark's smear campaign take away what I had worked for, what I had earned. Still, the weight of everything started to settle in. I could feel the pressure mounting as Mark's allies began to pull away, questioning my leadership. There were tense moments at the office, when people would hesitate before agreeing with my decisions, when I could see the doubt in their eyes. They weren't sure if I could hold it together. One night, I was sitting in my office reviewing the latest quarterly report when I received a call from the CFO. His voice was strained. "Christina, I think we need to talk. Mark has been reaching out to some of the investors. He's trying to get them to pull their funding. He's doing everything he can to create doubt about your leadership." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach, but I refused to let the fear show. "I'll handle it," I said firmly. "We've worked too hard for this to fall apart now. I'm not going to let him destroy everything." The next morning, I called a meeting with the senior management team. I laid out the facts. Mark was trying to sabotage us, trying to destroy the company from the inside. But I wasn't going to let that happen. I had spent years watching Mark make reckless decisions for the company, decisions that I had to clean up in the background. Now it was my turn to steer the ship. Mark may be trying to undermine me, I said, addressing the team. But we've built something great here, and I'm not going to let him tear it down. The room was quiet for a moment, the weight of my words sinking in. But then, one by one, the team members spoke up. They had seen the work I had put in, the countless hours I had spent keeping the company afloat when Mark was too busy with his personal life. They trusted me, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of relief. The foundation was solid, and I wasn't standing alone. Over the next few days, I took action. I reached out to the investors who Mark had tried to sway, assuring them that I was committed to the company's success. I met with key clients to discuss our future plans, outlining the strategies I was implementing to ensure growth and stability. And slowly, I began to rebuild the trust that Mark had tried so hard to destroy. But even as the company started to stabilize, I couldn't shake the feeling that this battle wasn't over. Mark would never give up without a fight, and I knew, deep down, that he was planning something bigger. As I sat at my desk one afternoon, reviewing the latest updates, I heard a knock at the door. I looked up to see one of my assistants standing there, holding an envelope. "This just came for you," she said, her voice a little uncertain. I took the envelope, recognizing the handwriting on the front. It was from Mark. I opened it, my hands trembling slightly as I read the contents. The letter was brief but ominous. Mark was threatening to take legal action, claiming that I had violated the terms of our divorce settlement. He was going to fight me in court for control of the company, no matter what it took. I set the letter down on my desk, my mind racing. He had found another way to try and tear me down. But this time, I wasn't going to be caught off guard. I had already anticipated this move. I had kept meticulous records of every decision I had made since taking control of the company. And I had a team of lawyers who were ready to fight back. I wasn't going to let Mark take everything from me again. Not this time. The legal battle that followed was one of the most grueling experiences of my life. Mark, ever the master manipulator, came out swinging. His lawyers were sharp, ruthless, and determined to claw back control of the company. They tried to paint me as an incompetent leader, someone who had no business running a business as large and complex as the one we had built together. They played up my emotional state, suggesting that my actions post-divorce were fueled by bitterness and resentment, and that I was simply out for revenge. But I wasn't going to let them win. I had kept records. I had documented every decision, every conversation, every step I had taken since I took control of the company. The evidence was clear. I had acted in the best interest of the business. I had steered the company away from disaster, while Mark had been too preoccupied with his personal life to notice the cracks forming beneath him. The first few days of the trial felt like a blur of testimony and legal jargon. Mark sat across from me, his smug smile replaced by an expression of raw anger. He tried to maintain his composure, but I could see the cracks in his carefully constructed facade. The longer the trial went on, the more desperate he became. He couldn't accept the reality that I was in charge now, and he was no longer the kingpin of his own empire. The turning point came when I was called to the stand. I had prepared myself for this moment, rehearsing the facts and keeping my emotions in check. But as I spoke, telling the jury about the work I had done to keep the company afloat, something shifted. The weight of everything I had been through, the betrayal, the struggle, the loneliness, poured out of me. I never wanted to take everything from him, I said, my voice steady but strong. I didn't want any of this. All I ever wanted was to be treated as an equal, to have my contributions acknowledged. But for years, Mark treated me like I didn't matter. He took me for granted, and he thought he could just walk away with everything. I looked directly at Mark as I continued. You may have been the face of the company, but I was the one who kept it running. You may have built it, but I made sure it survived when you couldn't be bothered to care. There was a long silence in the courtroom, and for the first time, I saw Mark falter. His lawyers, who had been so confident, suddenly seemed less sure of themselves. It was clear that the tide had turned in my favor. When the verdict was finally read, it felt like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. The jury ruled in my favor. I was granted full control of the company. and Mark's attempts to regain ownership were dismissed. I watched as Mark's face turned pale, the reality of his loss sinking in. He had lost everything: the company, his pride, and his sense of control. But for me, it wasn't just a victory. It was a reclaiming of my life, my identity, and my future. The courtroom, once a place of fear and uncertainty, had become my sanctuary. It was where I found my voice, where I proved to myself and to everyone else that I was more than just Mark's wife. I was a force in my own right. The months after the trial were filled with change. The company began to thrive again, thanks to the decisions I had put in place during the trial. I stabilized the business, secured new partnerships, and began building relationships with clients who had once only known Mark's name. I didn't have to prove myself anymore. My actions spoke louder than any words could. But more importantly, I learned to let go of the past. For so long, I had clung to the idea of who I was in relation to Mark. I had allowed myself to be defined by our marriage, by the company we built together, and by the life we once shared. But in the aftermath of the trial, I realized that my worth was never tied to him. It was mine all along. At the company's annual meeting, I stood in front of the board, the team, and our investors, addressing everyone with a sense of calm confidence that had taken years to cultivate. The room was full of new energy, new faces, new ideas. As I spoke about our plans for the future, I felt the weight of everything I had been through lift off my shoulders. The company, once a symbol of my loss, was now a testament to my strength. Later that evening, I received a call from one of our top clients. They had just renewed their contract with us for another 5 years, and the offer they were proposing would take the company to new heights. I smiled to myself, knowing that this was just the beginning. As I hung up the phone, I thought about how far I had come. From the woman who had been left with nothing, to the one who had rebuilt her life from the ground up. Mark had tried to take everything from me, but in the end, he had only given me the chance to reclaim it all. The best revenge wasn't about getting even. It was about moving forward. And I had done that stronger than ever, with a future full of promise and success. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was thriving.